But I wanted to start out by giving you an overview of why exactly we're here at this moment to have this discussion. There's a new movie out. It's called Spotlight. You may have heard about it, or you may have seen it. And Spotlight is a very faithful account of how the Boston Globe's special investigative team spent a full year trying to uncover a sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Diocese of Boston. The reporters at the Globe had worked for most of a year to obtain court documents from lawsuits that had been deliberately kept secret, and that would reveal that the clergy sex abuse scandal in the Boston Diocese was both widespread and ran very deep. It involved clergy at all levels. It involved a staggering number of clergy members in both the abuse that was uncovered and in the cover-up of the abuse. It appears that about 6% of priests, or some say as many as 9% of priests, have been involved in sex abuse scandals or sex crimes, mainly involving children, not just in Boston, but across the country and apparently all over the world. So the Boston Globe's work to uncover this in the year 2002 sent shockwaves not only through their own very Catholic city, but also across the country and even across the world, as diocese after diocese was found by journalists to be using the same tactics to cover up sex abuse. In fact, about 79% of all US dioceses have had sexual abuse allegations made against them. I'd like to show the trailer for this movie. It just came out, I think it was released on November 6th. I saw it the day that it opened, and I think it's playing in Stamford now and maybe some other places around the area. We can't show you the whole movie, but we can show you the trailer so you get a sense of the story, which is both about, you know, the abuse and the cover-up of the abuse, but of special interest to me as a journalist, it's about the work of journalists to uncover this. And seriously, the Spotlight group for a year worked on this story to be able to bring it out. And it's the kind of journalism that, you know, I admire more than any other kind, that they've put that much effort in for that long and really spent that much of their own money to uncover this story. So you can get at least a sense of the story by watching this trailer, and I'm gonna dim the lights for just a moment so you can see it better. And it's about a 2.5-minute clip.
I know there's things you cannot tell me. But I also know there's a story here, and I think everybody will hear about it.
Do you think your paper has the resources to take that on?
I do. Do you?
The Boston priest molested kids in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The church found out about it and did nothing. We haven't committed any long-term investigative resources to the case.
No, we haven't.
And that's the kind of thing your team would do. Spotlight?
Guys, listen, everybody's going to be interested in this.
Obviously, the church will fight us very hard.
Try to get some background information. I don't want you recording this in any way, shape, or form. Nothing.
We understand you've settled several cases against the church.
I can't discuss that.
There aren't any records of any of these settlements.
When you're a poor kid from a poor family, and when a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. How do you say no to God?
Spotlight.
The Tepfer.
You think he's got something?
I want to keep Dave. We need to focus on the institution. Show me that it came from the top down. They'll try to silence anyone who speaks out.
Leave me alone, you hear me, goddammit?
6% act out sexually.
6% is 90.
90 priests.
If there were 90 of these bastards, people would know.
Maybe they do.
You're going to give me the names and the names of their victims.
Are you threatening me?
I was doing my job.
Yeah, you and everyone else.
I am here because I care. We're going to tell the story. We're going to tell it right.
I'm hoping we can keep this between us until we all get on the same page. Is that why we're here, to get on the same page?
We've got 2 stories here. A story about degenerate clergy, and a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one. I'm not crazy. Take control of everything. This is not just Boston. It's the whole country. It's the whole world. They knew. They made money and happen. They could have been you. They could have been me. They could have been
All right. So, the thing is that the Boston Globe was not alone in 2002 in doing this investigative work. The lawsuit that they filed to get the win the release of documents in Boston. The same thing was going on in other cities by other newspapers. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Hartford Courant were also suing for release of documents from the Catholic Church. And so we're here today to discuss the story as it was found in the Bridgeport Diocese and in Connecticut. And to do this, we've invited 3 journalists from the area who've written extensively on sex abuse in the church for years and all the fallout from that, which is ongoing. It didn't end in 2002 when they broke this case in Boston. So I'm going to invite our panelists to come up. There's a step on the far end of the stage if you can come on up that way. And also Gail will join us, and I'll introduce them as soon as they're up and seated. So just to introduce our panelists to the group here, I'd like to first introduce Tom Connor on the end there. He writes for Connecticut Magazine. His 1999 article, Gods and Monsters, addressed the abuse scandal in the Bridgeport Diocese under Cardinal Edward Egan, who was then the Archbishop of Bridgeport. Tom's profile uncovered Egan's controversial views on the church's handling of the problem well before the national controversy fully surfaced. Tom has also written about accused sex abuser, and I'm gonna say this wrong, Tom, so you're gonna help me. Marshall Maciel Degolado. Okay, Maciel Degolado. Okay, good. He's the founder of the Legion of Christ, a wealthy and influential religious order based in Cheshire, Connecticut. We also have with us Dan Tepfer. He's written for the Connecticut Post for over 25 years, and he's dug deep into hidden stories of clergy sex abuse in Bridgeport and across Fairfield County for over a decade. Next to Dan, we have Gail Howard, she's managed programs and taught at NCC for many years, and she also organized this panel. She's the co-leader of Connecticut SNAP, which is the Survivors Network of those abused by priests. And shameless plug for Gail, she also teaches memoir writing and private workshops if you're interested in talking to her about that later. Next to Gail is Dan Tepfer. I'm so sorry, My notes got it wrong, but I already introduced Dan. This is Dave Altimari. Dave is a reporter for the Hartford Courant. His stories have won numerous awards, including the George Polk Award for coverage of corruption in the Rowland administration. Dave's comprehensive articles on clergy sex abuse in Connecticut have appeared regularly in the Hartford Courant for many years, including this year, because this is, as I said, an ongoing story. I'd like to begin our discussion just by beginning very simply to explain what the clergy are accused of having done, what the issue is here, so that some of our students and others in our audience who might not be entirely familiar with this issue can understand what's happened. And I think, Dave, I'd like to start with you, just to ask you about your involvement and the Hartford Courant's involvement in this story in 2002.
It was just about the same time that what we just watched came out, when the Globe published their series about priests in Boston and how they kept all these files secret over the years. It basically made newspapers think, well, probably the same thing's happening here. So in 2002, we went to court to try to get the Bridgeport Archdiocese to release files on 23 lawsuits that had been sealed from the public that involved 7 priests who were accused of sexually assaulting some of their flock. That took 7 years get those records unsealed. The case went to the Supreme Court, was argued in front of the Supreme Court a couple times, and it wasn't until 2009 that the records were actually finally unsealed. Now, in the meantime, some of those records were started to slowly come out, some were leaked. There was a fascinating case that involving one of these priests by the name of Lawrence Brett, who was one of the, I don't want to say worst, they were all pretty bad, but Brett had taken off to St. Martin and had been living in St. Martin for years, and there were people in the diocese who knew that, and we ended up, a couple of reporters ended up tracking him down in St. Martin, and we literally went down there and knocked on his door. He was walking his dog took some pictures of him and outed the fact that indeed they did know he was living there, and were well aware that they had buried him in St. Martin to keep him away from all the lawsuits. There were other, the Hartford diocese didn't get quite as much publicity as Bridgeport, but they had numerous priests. They ended up quietly making a settlement. They paid $22 million to people who were victims of 14 different priests. That happened in 2005. And there are still cases today. As Lori just mentioned, we have a case that's about to start trial in Hartford in a couple of weeks. A priest from East Windsor who, it's kind of an odd case, but there was a federal gun charge and when against some kid because he, following the Sandy Hook shooting, he made some kind of a threat that he was gonna shoot a bunch of people. And when they started investigating him, they found these guns that he had gotten from this priest. And they traced it back, and then they realized that the priest had been abusing the kid. And that priest is about to go on trial after Thanksgiving. His first one in a while is going on trial.
I would like to pass it over to Dan because, as Dave just said, the Hartford Diocese had its own scandals, but the Bridgeport Diocese, I think, it's a little bit more documented.
Well, just to put it in perspective, the Bridgeport Diocese, which covers most of Fairfield County, is probably the richest diocese in the country. And percentage-wise, 10% of the priests in this diocese have been accused of abusing children. Go back to the 70s. I first heard about abuse by priests in the early 80s. I was a police reporter at the Bridgeport Post, and we had an incident where a priest was murdered. He was stabbed with a pickaxe by a teenage boy. The lawyer for the boy, a young public defender, told me that they were going to claim a trial that the boy did this because he'd been molested for years by this priest. The police, however, said it was a robbery, even though the priest's money was found in his car, in his wallet, and there's no sign of anything taken. At that time, my editor said to me, no, we're going with the police view of this because priests do not sexually assault children. That doesn't happen. So we did.
So your editor said this can't be true.
And that happened through most of my career writing about this. It was 1996, November 96, when I first got a call by Paul Tremont, a Bridgeport lawyer, who ended up representing more than 24 people who claimed they were abused by children. He gave me a call and said, hey, I've got this case, and he'd done product liability, very successful. But he says, I want you to come over here and give me your opinion on this. So I came in his office, and there was a young woman sitting there, Sharon C. She grew up, very religious mother, father wasn't around. She ended up spending most of the time at church with this one priest, Father Raymond Chalka. Well, he ended up, over a 2-year period, sexually assaulting her. And she had a lot of problems, drugs and other problems, but eventually, kind of got through her life, but went to see Tremont because she was hoping that You know, she wanted to get some therapy, and she was hoping to get the diocese to pay for it. They turned her down when she went there. So I sat there and I interviewed her, and it was, eye-opening. As I said, at that time, we hadn't heard anything like this in Connecticut. There were stories out of Louisiana, and I think out of Rhode Island, Father Porter, but nothing in Connecticut at all. I went back and I told my editors, I had written up my interview, and they told me, no, we're not gonna run that, because it doesn't happen. She's obviously on drugs, she wants money, that's all she wants. It doesn't happen.
So you're really highlighting the sort of the unimpeachable reputation of the Catholic Church.
Well, you know, for over the next 5 or 6 years, I was threatened with firing half a dozen times. The diocese tried to have me arrested. Bishop Egan had me roughed up at one point. It was a tough struggle.
And I plan to kind of come back to the journalism involved in getting to the bottom of some of these cases. I'll ask you some questions about that in a little bit, but I want to bring Tom into the discussion because Tom's work on this, you've written a number of articles, but the one that I found really curious in the timeline was the Cardinal Egan profile that you wrote for Connecticut Magazine. It was in 1999. So, you know, as we've been hearing, these stories were surfacing for decades, really. 99 is 3 years before the Spotlight team is doing their work in Boston. But it seemed that it was no secret that people knew there was a problem, and you wrote about it. Could you tell us a little bit about writing that story?
Sure. Let me just say that Dan was the first reporter I knew in the state to start covering these cases. And before that, before the 90s, I saw Jason Berry, investigative reporter in New Orleans, who really broke it nationally, or would have, had there been an audience for it. He was a mentor of mine, and helped me with this. Just to frame this a little differently, I think it's accurate that 6% of priests, or about 6%, are ephebophiles, youth junkies, as it got going, which is the national average. The difference is the power structure. You know, no other institution wasn't covered up so thoroughly. And a case in point, which goes back to Egan, who will before, go back to the question, is Lawrence Brett, you know, who we all tracked, and a notorious guy, and a slippery guy. You know, when I was looking for him too, and I was in touch with the Hartford Courant, because I had tracked him to Maryland and Florida, where people were protecting him. It was well known where he was by certain people that were funding him, and he was still drawing checks from the diocese. You know, all the records were sealed. No one would talk to us. No one would talk to me. I had to, how I did this was to go to a lawyer who was furious about this. William Laviano, who was a lawyer in Ridgefield. And Egan, by the way, I didn't really do a profile of him because he wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't meet with me. Wouldn't meet with any of the victims. But I'm sorry for doubling back over. But one important aspect of this, aside from the power structure, was that Catholics themselves hadn't reached the threshold of acknowledging this. And I once asked a theologian, Eugene Kennedy, who's a prominent Catholic author, and I said, why is it, when the story broke nationally, finally, in 2002, why is it taking so long? He said, well, Catholics hadn't reached the threshold where there was so much evidence, because of the power of the church in our lives, in Catholics of my parents' generation. And even my generation, people told me when I started reporting this stuff, they would never speak to me again. How could I do this to the church? That's what I heard over and over again. Nothing about the children. How could I do this? So I was able to go around Egan in the hierarchy, and before him, Walter Curtis was bishop. And there's an interesting dichotomy between the two. And get some of the seals, some of the records that Laviano had procured, including a videotape which is still happening, of Egan on the stand, deposition. He was on his way to Rome, and Laviano stopped him from playing for Tarmon and got him to go before a judge, and caught him lying on the stand. He's fined $33,000 for lying. And so this is what we're up against. The difference between Curtis, just background, Walter Curtis was an older, I think retired bishop at the time. I don't know when he retired, but
He retired, I think, 3 years before Egan came in. Egan came in in '88.
yeah. And he had allowed a lot of this stuff to go on, which was the real crime here was when there were enough complaints in a diocese, like Stanford, about cases like Brett, they would say, well, we got to get him out of here. And in fact, there's another piece of the document, a letter by Monsignor that says, let's feign.
Gennaro.
Yeah, Gennaro. Let's feign that Lawrence Brett has a reoccurrence of hepatitis.
Yes.
No, it was hep C or hep B. To get him out of it. He was transferred then to 8 or 9 dioceses in Connecticut. Until they finally said, we don't have any place else to put him. So they sent him to the Order of Paracletes, a kind of halfway house for alcoholic priests, section of these problems, in New Mexico. But since there was a shortage of priests, as there was at the time, in the 80s, they let him out on the weekends to work with the kids in the town. And then the Order of Paracletes finally said, we can't handle this guy either. You got to take him back to Bridgeport. So Walter Curtis, I believe out of naivete, out of protecting the church, but more naivete than Egan, who was a canon lawyer and a very savvy guy. Walter Curtis placed Lawrence Brett with a family of 10 kids in California, Catholic family. Yep. And so what happened was that Laviano got a hold of the file, showed me this scrap of paper with a telephone number. That was a California number, he called it, and the young man answered, and he said, this is so-and-so, I'm doing this, and he said, I can't. The young man said, I can't talk to you. He said, no, you can talk to me. So, Egan had signed a check for $250,000 for his silence. I came off. And Laviano, who was, he was a big, fat, sloppy guy, and no one was going to push him around, including Egan. And he pulls up this slip of paper and he said, Your Eminence, you see this number? Recognize this? No, I've never seen it before. Well, I think. And so trying to get to Egan was very tough, and it showed me, and I'm sure fellow reporters at the same time, treatment, just stonewall any investigation into, because it threatened the power structure. It threatened the power structure and the money, because over $1 billion.
Yeah, and I'm really, I have some journalism students who are here today, and I'm really hoping to kind of dig into how one uncovers a story this difficult, this large. But I think there's more to say about the breadth of your coverage in general, just the kinds of stories that you were telling, what happened. I know, for example, Dave, I think you've been writing recently, or maybe you all have written some recently about the statute of limitations, the effort to extend the statute of limitations so that people as far as 30 years ago, who were abused as far as 30 years ago, can still file lawsuits about what happened to them. And I know that the church is continuing to fight that. So it's not like you wrote a bunch of stories and all of a sudden there was a sea change and everybody came clean about it. This is an ongoing battle. Maybe if you could update us on what the statute of limitations situation is.
They fought that for years. It eventually was, the legislature eventually got it. passed that the statute of limitations was changed to 30 years, which opened up a whole another round of lawsuits that we wouldn't have been able to file previously. They
sorry,
still are. They just went to court. They were in Supreme Court last year trying to get that overturned based on a Hartford case. They had lost a case at a jury. It was $1 million case of I don't know the priest. It was in the Valley. The case went to trial and they lost. The verdict was $1 million. They were trying to appeal the verdict, and part of it was they were trying to get that law overturned, which they did. They were not successful. Part of the reason why they fought so hard to keep those records sealed was the fact that Egan was trying to become a cardinal of New York, which he eventually did, and they didn't want those records to come out while he was up for that position, and then he eventually did get it. The testimony that Tom was talking about, Egan was one of the more disastrous pieces of testimony I've ever seen in a court case. He was. It was one of the few cases I went to. One of the first cases in Connecticut that went to trial involving a priest case. There was this guy out of Milwaukee named Frank Martinelli. It was a federal case. He was suing the diocese and Lawrence Brett. He had been one of Brett's boys, and I forget what they called him.
Mavericks.
Brett's Mavericks, yeah. And so he was suing, and that's why they deposed Egan. So they played the deposition, and he came off incredibly pompous to anybody who was there sitting in the courtroom listening to it, including the jury who clobbered the church ultimately in the case. And Egan basically, even in that deposition, even in that testimony, basically either didn't acknowledge that there were victims or basically said they were making it up. That's almost what he said, how he put it too. So he completely just ignored or didn't want to see the problem. And he was not a stupid guy. Tom's right. He was a lawyer. He knew exactly what he was doing and what he was saying, and he knew exactly what the consequences were. But he did end up getting the job in New York, and he left Lori to clean up the mess after he was gone.
When you say Lori,
Bishop Lori, I'm sorry, who's now in Baltimore. Right? Is he Baltimore? Yeah. He was Curtis, Egan, William Lori, who was the bishop at the time in 2002 when became the bishop on a lot of the stuff Earl came in Connecticut. Egan had left and gone to New York and left it all behind by that point.
you know, there are just so many different aspects to the story. So many different things have been uncovered. You know, when you first look in, when one first looks into it, it's horrible but kind of simple. You know, clergy members abusing children in the church, but actually it gets, the cover-up part of it gets so complicated, and the issues seem to extend beyond the boundaries of the church proper. You know, there have been stories, I think, Dan, you wrote about the Haiti mission, and Fairfield University. I wonder if you could just, you know, for the sake of the audience, explain a little bit about what happened in that situation.
Well, in that case, that was a man who graduated from Fairfield University and very popular, started this charity program in Haiti for children down there, and you know, briefly it came to light that he was molesting children in Haiti, dozens of children.
I wonder if you have an opinion on, you know, is that where this, is the story about the abuse, or is it about the cover-up? Is it the whole thing, or is it something that we're not even seeing? I mean, the depth and breadth of this story seems so huge as a person looking at it, not as a journalist, but as a person involved in the story itself. I wonder how you see this.
Well, I think the important thing is, and you'll see the movie points this out, that we're looking at a system. The individual stories of abuse are ones that I hear. Many of the people who come to SNAP meetings never confront the church or go to lawyers. So there are many hidden stories in Fairfield County, and they're heartrending stories of people who've just gone off track. They don't know how to be adults after they've been sexually abused as children. So I see it from that vantage point. But the reason so many victims exist is that the church ran child abuse rackets, allowing priests to move from parish to parish, not warning the parish or the families that a child molester would soon be, alone with their kids. And this, some priests were abusers for decades. So looking at the church as, an entity that kind of proves the adage, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The story is so very ugly, I think, because the church was allowed to corner enormous power. Had tremendous power. People thought they had to believe everything the church said and do everything the church told them to do, or their very souls were in danger. So that's a lot of power. And so they were able to get away with things that I think otherwise it really wouldn't have.
If we shift the discussion a little bit from what the story is to how the story gets uncovered, why it took journalists so long and so many resources to do this, I think maybe the first question that I would have for anyone who can explain it a little bit, particularly knowing my journalism students might be in the audience. The fact that these documents from the church and that these lawsuits were under seal, that's an unusual arrangement. And I'm not sure I entirely understand how that was allowed to come about. I believe from seeing the movie Spotlight that there was a certain collusion within the courts of Boston and the Diocese of Boston to just kind of keep things quiet. That doesn't seem legal to me, and I wonder if you could explain, without getting too far into the weeds really, how it is that these lawsuits could be kept secret, that these documents that reporters have been secret for so long were allowed to be hidden from public view.
Actually, in Connecticut, it was worse than that. Connecticut used to have a system where there were cases where there was never even any record of them. There was literally cases that there was no docket number, there was nothing ever public. These cases, you could see there would be, Jones versus Archdiocese of Bridgeport, or whatever it may be. You wouldn't be able to see the file, but there was a caption and there was a case number. There were many cases in Connecticut for years that had nothing. They were secret files. So Connecticut's had a history of that. I think you find there are certain institutions, the church was obviously one of them, where they got this system, or had this system where once they started getting cases sealed, they just kept getting them sealed. And they went to the same judges, and they had judges that they knew would be favorable to them to seal their cases. A lot of times how these cases get uncovered, Dan mentioned Tremont, they had a lot of cases. They were one of the first lawyers involved with some of the victims and that's how you really do find some of these cases. It's either a victim who was brave enough to come forward and talk, or an attorney who gets fed up with what he sees. Sometimes you get lucky. I actually had a case literally that started when I was driving my daughter to a YMCA basketball game that happened to be at the St. Thomas Seminary in Bloomfield. And every time we drove there, there was a state police cruiser parked in the back. And it always struck me as weird because nothing's there anymore at that seminary. Cronin, the former archbishop, was there, and that's about it. So one time when I dropped her off, I took down the license plate and I called somebody at DMV, it was a buddy of mine, asked him to look up the plate. And it turned out it came back to this guy named Stephen Foley, who was a priest, or had been a priest, and had been a state police chaplain, and had basically used his position as a chaplain to molest boys for a period of years before someone figured out what was going on and stripped him of his being a state police chaplain. So even after all that, he was still somehow had gotten a hold of a cruiser, the cars the state police drive. They didn't have the lights or anything, but he was still driving around in one until we wrote about him. And it turned out there were a bunch of lawsuits that got filed after that. And the church had been paying for Foley to live at the seminary. He lived there for free. Food, everything was free. Matter of fact, he lived right next to Cronin. And then they realized it was going to be bad publicity when we had pictures of him and his, wheeling out of the seminary in his cruiser. So they kicked him out, and he ended up in Virginia. But that story all started. There were a bunch of lawsuits filed. They settled several cases, several seven-figure cases against him when it all settled. And that basically started it because I happened to see this cruisers, I happened to see this car sitting behind the seminary one night. So you never know.
If I could just, please, I hate you.
No, go ahead.
My situation was somewhat different. I mean, Tremont had begun filing lawsuits for victims in '96, and immediately the diocese came in. They were ordered by a judge to turn over information, including information they had in their so-called secret archives, which we didn't know ever existed until all of a sudden they were ordered to do this. And then we found out that all complaints of abuse by priests are put in these secret archives and had for years. So they were ordered to turn over this information to the judge, and it was all, and Judge Levin, did it under seal. And but to get around this, Paul Tremont would file a motion, we'd have a hearing, and he would end up standing in front of the judge, reading from this material out loud with me sitting in the courtroom. And I would be taking down every word of what was in these secret archives. I remember at one point that I actually have a transcript that the lawyer from the diocese turned around to complain that Tremont was doing this and saying, "And Your Honor, there is the devil's scribe sitting in the back taking down every word."
It's deeply troubling to me that the court system, I mean, the church is deeply troubling enough, but on top of that, we have to worry about a court system that has secret archives and sealed cases. Is there a standard that's applied to what gets sealed and what doesn't? Is it because it involved children, or?
The reasons the diocese gave was that there was information that not only involved children, but also the workers of the church that they were afraid it would get out. Some judges, after Judge Levin stepped down from the cases, we had another judge, Skolnick, who did open up a lot of the cases until, on a motion by the diocese, he was removed from the case.
So it's
up to the judge, really. I mean, there's supposed to be a basis that they're supposed to follow, but really it's a discretionary decision by each judge, and each judge will rule differently.
Of course, in Boston, it was they finally got a judge who unsealed some of these lawsuits and these cases.
And it happened here as well, later on.
I think part of the problem is, in Boston particularly, but also in Connecticut, was that the church very knowingly and played the Catholic card. A lot of Catholic priests, Catholic judges, who were under the thumb of the church in a way, holding to it. And that and the reluctance of victims to come forward, because many of them or a number of them, no one had believed them. The priests themselves would tell them, who's going to believe you? Who would believe that the priests would do that? Their own parents wouldn't believe them. They were exiled by the community, more or less. And let me just say some words about Gail's group, SNAP, the network, those abused by priests, and David Gillespie, director, who I talked to over the years and was really helpful, who was, I don't know if Porter was his user, but as a national group who's worked tirelessly to give victims a voice. And that's partly how I came into it too, by meeting Frank Martinelli. And I bring a little more personal history to this, having been abused. But still, to hear these people who had never talked about it, never knew they could, when the first victims came out and started to talk about it, that changed too. So it was a combination of forces that were suppressing everything, and forces too that eventually helped them speak.
And let me just slip in a word here. You'll see a little card. If you don't have one, there's more in the back. And it's just a little snip of information about, if you could pass those down to people who don't have them. It's kind of snapped by the numbers. And their guess is that 1 in 10 victims has actually come forward. So a major concern of SNAP is that there are all kinds of people walking around who have never told anybody what happened to them, and that SNAP is available to help out and provide some solace and company and advice on next steps. So if you know anyone that you suspect or that who has confided in you that they have been hurt, their phone number's on here for to get some help themselves. It's a great website as well, tons of information.
And I just want to back up for just a second. And as I said, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but the more I've heard discussions and radio interview programs and other places I've heard people talking about this, the more I just keep having the question about what documents actually got released. And to just step my students through this, students who might be in the audience through this a little bit, when you cover the courts, there's a public record of all the different cases that are coming before judges, it's docket, and as you pointed out, these cases against the church were listed, it's just that the documents relating to those cases were sealed, and so the lawsuit was to get those unsealed, and we've heard a little bit that they might have contained information about the workings of the church. You know, this might be proprietary sort of church information that somehow was protected. When the documents finally were released, what were the documents that had been sealed?
A lot of them were depositions by the priests, by monsignors, and then the hierarchy in the church. And that, a lot of it,
Personnel files.
Some personnel files.
There was a lot, what happened was they basically moved these priests. They would move them from one church to another. Some of them they sent to New Mexico to get treatment. Many of them ended up at the Institute of Living in Hartford to get supposedly cured. And then they just put them back into a parish. So if they had been accused of molesting somebody in Derby, they'd put them in a parish in Wallingford, or they'd put them in a parish, they'd go exact opposite ends of the area and put them in a different, with different people, and just keep moving them around. And all that would be in those files. When they were transferred, when they were sent to a treatment center. Baltimore was another one where they sent people. All that was in those files that they fought hard to keep secret.
Have you done any investigations or any stories about the Center for Living in Hartford where many of the priests were sent?
The IOL, we did some, not as much as I would have liked, frankly. Hard to to be fair, it is hard to investigate it as in effect as a mental.
I tried to, I mean, I talked to the director, Leslie, I didn't get much.
Is that a private institution or is it a church?
Yeah. He lived on my street. Hank Schwartz was the head of my
And other elements of reporting for this story, you've talked a little bit about the difficulty of speaking to victims if they don't come forward. So you kind of have to wait for them to come forward. But there are some sort of gumshoe journalism things that you did, and one of those stories involved Walter Coleman. Dan, I think you wrote a story where you tracked him down in Miami. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Walter Coleman had molested his wife. Not only was he molesting his wife, but he was sleeping with his mother at the same time. Gave her an engagement ring. Anyway, he was no longer a priest. They took away his ability to be a priest in this diocese.
Do you know where he had been?
Been in a couple places. Been in Bridgeport. He had been in Trumbull, which turned out to be the center of abuse. Most of the priests went through St. Teresa's to Trumbull. He'd been in different places, but when they took away, generally when they removed the ability to practice from the priest, they don't. It's not laicized, but they're just kind of suspending their practice. They stay in the area. They're supported by the diocese, but they're told they can't be in a church. They can't be a priest. In Coleman's case, however, he went down to Florida, and I received a call from somebody who'd just been at that church and seen Coleman on the pulpit there, and he had my number and called me. He was here. She couldn't believe it. How can that be? How can that be? And then I called the diocese, and they're like, "Oh, we didn't know anything about this." And then I found out later that they called the archdiocese then and he was removed from that church as well.
So whether or not people get deliberately relocated, or in this case, Coleman had retired and then managed to get himself.
Right. Well, the same thing that happened with Brett. I mean, he was at a church in Sacramento, California, and at one point, the archdiocese officials in Sacramento had sent a letter to Bishop Curtis in Bridgeport saying, "Oh, we have this priest, we're short-handed, and he's here. Is there any problems with him?" And they sent the letter back, "No, he's fine. He's a priest in good standing." And they let Brett, where he then sexually assaulted several children in Sacramento.
And how come there are never any criminal charges?
Well, criminal charges have a strict statute of limitations, which at that time was 5 years. So, and then it didn't come out well beyond that in most cases.
In fact, there have been criminal charges. There are many priests who've gone to prison and killed in prison. James Porter is not here. And now, as we know, bishops are being held accountable for covering up. I think the case of Philadelphia. So once the church finally had to acknowledge that it wasn't an American problem. It wasn't a matter that of gay priests coming through the seminaries in the 70s. It wasn't Satan in the Vatican. They went through all the possible scenarios that they could and said, okay, this is an international problem. To this day, they still don't. I maintain even Francis, as good as he man as he probably is, doesn't really get it. Egan did not get it. 10 years after I interviewed him, I went back to New York. He retired, as you know. He had a convent torn down and built a penthouse apartment for himself. Both Chapel was a really beautiful place. And I think he was 80 then, and he either forgot that I was the writer who had written a scathing story about him, or he didn't care, because he was in my mind, ruled by hubris. So he invited me to the city to talk to him. And at one point, he said, I had seen a letter that he'd written to the Diocese of New York, and it was a real legal document. It said, if under any circumstances someone was possibly harmed by priests under our care, then I'm sorry. It was cautiously worded. So I asked him about that, and he said, well, I made a mistake. I said, you mean it in writing, in the tone of that letter, or the wording of that letter? He said, no, I should never have apologized. We didn't do anything wrong. This was 3 years ago.
I'd just like to say I had a number of run-ins with Egan. While he was not pleasant at all, he had his assistant knock me down, and when I tried to ask him to drag, I found the rotary of me. But he, things that he did to cover up. I remember a woman calling me in tears. Her daughter had worked at the rectory of St. Augustine's. She'd gotten pregnant by a priest there. Egan called her into the office, sat behind his desk, and very tall, big man with a booming voice. And he chastised this poor girl, calling her a sinner, and this was all her fault. And if she told anybody, she was going to lose her job at the rectory. And then a second later going and then becoming her father figure. But I'm going to take care of you. We're going to take care of you. And this whole thing. And it was hard. The priest was handed some money in an envelope, and he ended up in New Jersey teaching elementary school.
Well, Pachoka would hear confessions after abuse.
Oh, absolutely.
Forgive them their sins.
Pachoka was another one that I confronted outside his lawyer's office, and unbelievable. It's just totally, his affect was just couldn't believe it.
I really could follow up with about a dozen questions. Each revelation leads to more questions, but in the interest of time, what I want to make sure that I can do is turn this over to our audience for some questions if they have them. We didn't screen any of our audience members. We have no idea what might be on their minds today, so let's begin over here.
Thank you. I think you did a great job. I know 3 of you, sir, I don't know you, but I guess you broke the story and that maybe for everyone else. For your journalism students, most of whom have left, I've become a journalist in a way because of this. In 2003, I started following it with a group of people who were here from what's called Voice of the Faithful in the Diocese of Bridgeport. And victims needed support. They found it first from Barbara Blaine and Dave Altimari and national, and now it's international. It's very powerful. What I'd say is sex, money, power. This story had all the things in it, right? Yeah. Is there any other human motivation that's hotter than sex, money, and power? No. So if there's a journalism students here, then they following a story that has it. A comment was made, a richest diocese. I don't know whether we're richest or not, but our group went and looked in the books. You go around to the county, to the Fairfield County offices, the assessor's offices, and you add up all the property you can find in church name, and we found it was almost $1 billion. That's real estate, land and building. That was not financial accounts. But that's one area. In terms of the people who were harmed, part of the story that didn't come out here is that the harm as youth by trusted adults is so profound that I'm not a psychologist, but they're able to separate, repress, or whatever the process is, and keep it out of. No one wants to hear about it. And they don't get anyone they don't get a free time to tell it. So it gets stuck, and the SOLs and whatever take their time. Bottom line is that in this story, Gail and I want to talk about bishopaccountability.org, great source of information forever. It's archived. The story is archived, and anybody who's interested ought to go to bishopaccountability.org, because it shows not just what happened in Connecticut, in the Archdiocese of Hartford, and the Diocese of Bridgeport, but all over.
Thank you for that.
Last comment is, so Gail and I and a representative of Bishop Accountability are on the street, and I forget what the reason was, but that we were there that day for a press conference.
We were asking the state's attorney's office to look at the released files for evidence of additional crimes.
So this
that
was
had
back
not
3 or 4
yet
years ago. And I'm there as a rep from our group, and I'm holding a picture of one of the offending priests who was in prison, took his own life. And I'm just holding it there, and had my 1 minute of fame on video, made my statement, and I stood there, and a man comes down the street, and he's standing there just looking at this. And I said, do you understand what we're doing here? And he said, no, but I know who that is. He abused me. And this is a man who was living in Stanford, who'd been released after 16 years in Enfield. He had alcohol, he had substance abuse issues from the time he was a teenager when the priest was the perpetrator. So these stories are long and they're difficult, and I know Dan, so I said, I went over to Dan after listening to him, to the gentleman, Steve, tell his story. And I said, Dan, would you talk to this man, just see what you hear? And I asked him 25 minutes later, and he said, very credible story. Because there you need good companions who have heard a lot of things and know. Because it's hard to go and get the written documents. When somebody doesn't want you to have written documents, you aren't getting it. So anyway, thank you for holding it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Some other questions in the audience?
One of the arguments I remember hearing from the church against opening the documents was that promises of secrecy or privacy had been made as part of past settlements, which is a common practice. So I wonder if you could comment on the reasonableness or the issues with that kind of defense.
Whenever the diocese settled the case, which they did quite a bit, is they always had a condition that, and everybody had to sign off saying they wouldn't release the terms of the settlement. That happened fairly regularly. I mean, they could still tell you that there was a settlement, they just basically could not tell you the amount and the terms. But there are always ways to find that out in general amounts.
That was part of the problem too, that there were so many settlements that weren't. I mean, the only indication that there was one in the case of Lawrence Brett and the 10 children in California was a slip of paper with a phone number. That's all it took. But it also took a lawyer who said, "Don't worry about the church. I'll handle Egan. You know, you can tell me."
Let me make a shameless plug for the importance of newspaper reading then. You know, when people are reading these stories, because they are reading newspaper and they're paying attention, then they call it and the story grows. Yeah, that's great.
I'll mention that Barbara Blaine, who is the founder of SNAP, was abused. She's from Chicago, abused for many, many years by a priest in her parish. And when she became an adult, she came back to the church and said, you know, this happened to me. And she was told that no one had ever made a complaint against this priest, and that he would be removed and kept away from children, so nothing like this would ever happen again. Those were both lies. They had lots of complaints against this guy, and he went right on abusing people. So she then went to law school so that she could help fight this in the courts. Then she went on to found the Survivors Network. So it's actually just celebrated its 25th anniversary. Yeah, it's actually now 26 years. Yeah, with David.
Couple
Yes.
more questions, yeah.
My name is Paul, and I'm a retired journalist, and I was the editor of the Telegram and Gazette in Worcester, Massachusetts in '92. And this was before the revelations in Boston. And we found out that there was this problem, and it had received no publicity, and there was no knowledge of any settlements in the courts. And even though I was a top editor, I became personally involved because I still am a Catholic. And I had a very strong policy against unnamed sources. And we did find victims who were willing to talk to us, to talk to our reporters, but they said, you can't name me. I mean, these were now adults, most of them men, a few women. And these crimes had happened when they were minors. And they said, I want to get this information out, but you can't name me. And I had a policy against that, so I had to meet with these individuals and say, we won't run the story without naming you. We're going to do it with sensitivity, we'll do it carefully, we're not going to be sensational, but we want to tell the story. And most of them came around. And so the point of what I want to make is, to me, the heroes of this continuing story, which is global, it's not just the United States, it's a big story in Ireland, Austria, and other countries. The heroes are the victims who come out and tell their story.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, and the early victims were hounded by lawyers for the Catholic Church who tried to destroy their credibility in court and really were vicious. And those, I always look on those early reporters of their own abuse as amazingly strong people.
Just a couple more questions. We're running out of time. I'll go here and then up there. Go ahead. Yes, please.
I was just going to say, when the documents were released, one of the shocking things was that the priests were not removed from ministry until the case actually went to court. And then it happened instantly. And that was case after case.
So denial of the problem until it could be denied any further.
Yeah, in the case of Father Cholka, Paul Tremont told me he had filed notice with the diocese that he was going to file suit with them. And the next day I went down to Greenwich where Father Cholka was pastor of the church there, only to find the place was in disarray. And the secretary said, we don't know what happened. Last night a car pulled up. Father Cholka was put in the car with his belongings and they went away. We don't know where he is.
My question is about, with the revelation, what has changed with regard to the criminal side of pursuing Catholic Church or a priest or being vigilant? Because when in the criminal system, when the state's attorney or U.S. attorney gets wind of something like this, they tend to take proactive measures to make sure that they issue subpoenas or they do things so that they can gather the evidence and put together a case. So I'm wondering, what, based on all the publicity, because once the publicity comes out, a lot of times you'll see the criminal system jump into action kind of after the fact. And I'm just wondering, with all the revelations, and it just seems like an impossible thing that you have to reveal. But once it's out there now, and we know, and with it being so rampant, with it being worldwide, what efforts have we made, even if we aren't doing anything, what efforts have we made criminally to get in front of this as a preventative?
A lot of prosecutors have jumped on this, but it took a while. It wasn't just the revelations of the Boston case, which was huge because of law, because of the number of priests. But it's just, again, it's just crossing the threshold and taking time to have it sink in, the magnitude of the problem. Lori, one thing I might say, if any of your students are still here, I think all of us found that a year to look at this stuff is not a long time. If you get hooked on a story, you want to stay with it still you're satisfied. I mean, Dan has covered it for 30 or 40 years.
That means I'm old.
Well, I'm older, probably, and I covered it since '98, and I took, just for a magazine article, it took over a year. Had a 1.5-foot pile of documents. You just want to pursue the story. You want the story. You want the truth, and the more horrific it is, the more you want to reveal.
You know, your comment on that brings to mind one of my questions that, you know, it seems in this area that the earliest that we can go back with complaints or allegations would be the 60s. I imagine it's earlier. I wonder if anybody, you know, and at this point, people only live so long, so things that might have happened earlier we may never know about, but it really does. And also speaking to Althea's question about, you know, what are we doing to get ahead on this thing, it seems like a problem that could almost be, you know, centuries old if you really thought about it.
4th century.
It's an institutionalized problem that any other institution that you might uncover something like this in, if it were a school, for example, I can't imagine that there wouldn't be all kinds of criminal investigations going on now. So it's a very curious and troubling thing. I'm going to have 2 more questions. I'm going to go here and then there, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. Yep.
I'm always curious about this facility out in New Mexico, and I didn't realize it was one up in Hartford. But I guess I was trying, the priests that finally are tossed out, so to speak, do we know that they didn't, through the facility that before on reserve, I mean, do they have a success rate at all, or do we know what is their, yeah, he's okay to go back into the population? I mean, I'm always hearing about this facility in New Mexico, but I never, once I hear they've been there, I never know.
Order of the Paracletes.
The what?
The Order of the Paracletes is the name of it.
Okay.
And Brett was there, others were there. And I think part of the church's, Egan's at least, and others, retort to that was, look, they told us that the priests were cured. Institute of Living in Hartford too. They sent them back, they put them through treatment, and said it was okay. We paid the best money, we paid the bills, we went along with their, why they, if they in fact had said that, I don't know. I'm sure there was a term that you can stay for 30 days or something, 28 days. I don't know what the terms were. But from the cases I knew, and Dan and Dave probably know more, it was abominable failure rates. I mean, they didn't change anyone.
That's a question.
It's not a question. I think it was true that the church was allowed to handle these cases internally, and now they have to be reported.
Well, they're supposed to be reported back to them.
Well, okay, but now.
Theoretically, they're supposed to be reported to
Now they really have to report them, is that true?
They were supposed to be.
Because now the bishops would be liable. I mean,
There's more awareness of it, yes.
Yeah.
Although there hasn't been, I mean, I don't think there's many prosecutors that have taken on any of these. I mean, most of these cases, frankly, were old, so they were well past the statute of limitations when they came out. We haven't really had a test case, so to speak, of someone, you know, since 2002 or since, you know, the early this decade where there was a potential criminal investigation, but I never got the impression that there were any prosecutors who were chomping at the bit to take on criminal cases involving priests in the church, by the way.
In other cities, in other states, yes, like Philadelphia.
Yeah, but it kind of, I mean, maybe Dan may have a better idea, but I don't.
I only know of one priest, Father Donovan, who was actually arrested for, and that was for getting a teenager drunk. Never got to the stage of what would happen afterwards, but he was prosecuted. But other than that, no. So as you said, it's all been beyond the, you know, it's been a 5-year statute of limitations until rather recently. So, haven't had any new cases.
Right, and now the Connecticut statute is 30 years, but that's for civil.
That's for civil cases, still 5 years for criminal cases. Go ahead, one last question.
One of the first psychiatrists who treated these priests, offending priests, made it very clear to, especially the hierarchy in the United States, that none of these men could be ever healed nor cured. And the best thing to do was for the church to buy an island and put them all on it.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Syke? Was it
Richard
Syke?
Syke.
Richard Syke.
Well, it's not that pedophiles aren't limited to the Catholic Church, certainly. It's a cultural phenomenon, and the success rate of curing a pedophile in any area of our communities, as I know of it, it's not a curable condition. It's, I mean, like, never say never, but it's very seriously damaged individuals who have a very low success rate in healing. I'm gonna suggest that any other questions you might ask amongst ourselves as we kind of wrap up and leave today. But I want to say thank you to everybody who came, and to those of you who hung in through the entire thing. We ran a little long, which I think is a sign of how important a subject this is, and how great the interest and how important it is. So let me extend a very deep, grateful thank you to our panelists for coming.
So my name is Tom Connor, and I'm an adjunct in the English department here. And I've been a kind of the Catholic affairs correspondent for Connecticut Magazine for about 20 years. Also write for the New York Times, Bloomberg Business Week, Fortune. I've written half a dozen books. And I was invited here, so that's my journalism background. Started writing in college for the Hartford Crimson, and out of college for the New York Times. And Lori, I think, or Snap, forget her name, invited me, because I've been in touch with SNAP's Survivors Network of those abused by priests for many years, because they're a good source of information about this subject. But in the end, you have to rely on the facts, which is documents that you have, testimony from victims, what authorities say and don't say. And so my research, a lot of my research, was through attorneys who snuck me documents that they probably shouldn't have. But they weren't being that objective either, because no one can maintain their total objectivity in cases like this, in stories like this. It's very hard to. And there's an emotional toll that's taken. Doesn't compare to what the victims went through, you know. But as a reporter, being close to it and understanding the depth of the problem and the machinations of the problem makes you very vulnerable. When I was first writing about this, 3 years before the Boston cases, I had a young son growing up, and I could not keep the material in my house. It was so disturbing. So I think the answer is that you do the best you can, you know, and you rely on your editor to ask the hard questions. Do you really know that this is the case?
Where do you think this story is going next? Because this story had been ongoing probably since the start of the Catholic Church centuries ago.
Yeah.
So where do you think the story is going to be going into next?
Well, I think it's been going into Latin America, where it already is. It started in this country, went to Ireland, Germany, Italy, Austria, Canada, Latin America's huge Catholic population, and it's the Catholic strongholds where it's the hardest for children those abused, to speak out, because their parents are staunch Catholics. That's where it's going, and I think more pressure on Pope Francis to make bishops and cardinals accountable, legally accountable for covering up cases, as they've done in almost every diocese.
I'm Gail Howard, and I am co-leader of the Connecticut SNAP. So each state has a chapter. So I'm co-leader of the Connecticut chapter. Okay? And I'm a survivor. I'm not a journalist, but rather a writer.
And how has your experience as a survivor helped inform you to be able to take part in SNAP and be able to help other survivors?
Right. Well, SNAP is entirely made up of survivors. And when people are going to take the step to come forward and talk about something humiliating and deeply personal and horrifying, it's comforting to find that you're in a room with other people who've had the same experience and have survived it. So SNAP does a lot to just kind of build people up and get them to believe and really feel that they are survivors, that the experience they had is not going to run the rest of their lives. So most states have at least monthly meetings of survivors. We accept phone calls from, we have a website with our phone numbers on it, and we accept calls from people who are stepping forward for the first time. Well, SNAP has a mission to protect children from abuse, support survivors, and reveal the truth. So they do a lot of work. If someone is going to come forward and talk about past abuse, SNAP will hold a press conference and get media attention to individual instances. But they act in a way that protects the victim until that person is really ready to be in the spotlight. So they have brought many cases to light initially by preparing the victim and bringing them to the point where they can do some kind of press conference. They also know lawyers who work with people to bring cases to court where there is the possibility of a court case. So they do a lot to connect resources, work with journalists to bring the truth to light, and alert people to the fact that the problem is not over. That's a huge message that SNAP gets out there. The church is telling everybody, oh, that happened a long time ago, and now it's all over. It's not over. I talk to victims who haven't yet come forward. There are priests still in ministry in the Bridgeport Diocese who've been accused of abuse. They're just well connected, so they haven't lost their jobs. And the reality is that the priests who have lost their jobs are not in jail because the criminal statute of limitations passed when any court civil case went to court. So those people are unaccounted for and are wandering the streets.
What is SNAP's goal or what they want to accomplish in the next 25 years?
They would like to make the problem of sexual abuse something that everybody knows something about. And everybody's on the alert. Nobody ever assumes that you can trust an individual who has authority to be alone with children. So it's not the job of children to bring this to light. It is the job of the society as a whole and to protect children. It's our job to protect our children. So that's SNAP's message.
I am Lori Soderlind. I am the program coordinator for communication arts at Norwalk Community College, and I teach journalism here. And I was approached by Gail Howard, who is a former colleague of mine at the college, and Gail thought that we should put together a panel for on this issue of sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, to time with the release of the movie Spotlight about the Boston Globe's investigation into the widespread cover-up of a sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church in that diocese. So Gail came to me with the idea, and I was her helper here with the resources of the college, the location, and some other things that we could put into use for this event. Well, I had organized my questions in 3 parts. I wanted to get the basic overview of the scandal in the church, and really to get the journalists talking about the stories that they wrote so that they could lay out for the audience how really widespread this whole abuse scandal is. They're saying between 6 and 9% of priests are sexual abusers, and that's a lot. And I wanted the first section of questions to deal with just how big the scandal is and the stories that were written about it. And I wanted the second part to have to do with the kind of journalism that's involved in that, which is the questions I was asking about. How is the court allowed to make documents secret, and what do you do to get documents that are under seal released? What does it take? So that was the sort of second area of questioning, and I didn't even get to ask all the questions I had about it because we were running out of time. And the third area I wanted to talk about, which got answered really along the way, was the ramifications of this and some of the backlash. You know, some of these journalists got a lot of they got into trouble with their readers or people who were defenders of the church. I would have liked to have more time to ask them about that. But the point truly is that the story's not over. It's still going on. There's still more stories to write. There's still new court cases coming up all the time. So we asked a little bit about that. Well, I have to give Gail credit for actually inviting the panelists, and Gail has been involved in this issue for a long time, personally as a co-leader of SNAP. And she has been following the subject in the press in Connecticut for years. So she knew to bring them here, but what I found fascinating about the representation on our panel was that we had somebody from the Hartford Courant who was involved in this, the lawsuits against the church in 2002. At the same time, the Boston Globe and the New York Times and the Washington Post were bringing lawsuits against the church to try to get documents, secret documents, released. So that Hartford angle to that story, the story that's in the movie that just came out, is really interesting to me and important, I think. And the Connecticut Post is a Hearst newspaper in Bridgeport. Bridgeport's the largest city in Connecticut, and the diocese is large, and this scandal was in full-blown force in Bridgeport. So Dan, working for the Connecticut Post, was very involved in uncovering many of the abuse stories there. And as you heard on the panel, Dan had been covering these stories since the 1980s. So if you see the movie Spotlight, you get the impression that all of this kind of came to light in 2002. But that was only the year that the courts finally let the secret documents, the secret court documents, come out into the public. But journalists like Dan and the Connecticut Post had been writing stories about priest sexual abuse for a long time before that. And these allegations go back to the 60s and further, only it's harder, I think, for people of that earlier generation to come forward. I think that we've developed a culture that is making it increasingly acceptable for people to come forward and tell their stories. So Dan, working for the Connecticut Post, was able to tell some of those stories starting around the 1980s. And Tom Connor actually teaches as an adjunct in our English department here, but he writes for the Connecticut Magazine, and he has done some really excellent in-depth pieces about this issue and his work on Cardinal Egan, who was a very, very powerful person in the church. and had been the Archbishop in Bridgeport. Tom's stories about him were really revealing, kind of showed what the power structure is that the world is up against when they take on this issue. So that's the panel that Gail really assembled, and my job was to read a lot of the work that these guys had done and understand how the story in Connecticut unfolded so that I could ask them good questions about the work they did. And it was really hard to decide what to ask them because there's so many things to ask them about. I wanted them to lay out exactly and clearly for us what had happened, what this abuse scandal is all about, the kinds of stories they wrote about it. But I also really wanted them to talk about the journalism involved in revealing some of this. And you know, if those newspapers hadn't have invested their own resources into lawsuits demanding access to documents, much of this would never have come to light. So the fact that those 4 newspapers, the Hartford Courant, Boston Globe, New York Times, the Washington Post, hired lawyers and spent lots of money to sue the Catholic Church, which is a huge, rich institution, and can fight you hard in court, fought them for years. The fact that those newspapers sunk their resources into this is really important and shows you what journalism can do.
Do you plan on doing more of these sorts of panels about maybe other topics or about other aspects of journalism?
Well, I love doing panels. I would do these more often if I could, but it's very unusual and sort of special that something as big as this has been brought into the public because of the release of the movie Spotlight. When you can time something to the release of a major movie, then you get more public attention and interest in the subject. You know, you don't want to be doing stories about things that are 40 years old or, you know, like Watergate, you know, and you can't do panels on a lot of things and hope to draw a big audience. But this was a kind of a special case. So, yeah, if we find more things to do in the future that are as interesting, we'll do them. But this was pretty special.